To begin with, my table is incredibly basic, having two values in salesperson and a quantity and a total column, because the point isn't the data, it's the visualization. In this video, I want to show how you can make a graph in Power BI have a dynamically updating title. In the first method, where I've cheated and already done it, this utilizes bookmarks and the other utilizes field parameters. In order to do the bookmark method, I've created two bookmarks, one called total, where my graph has salespeople in the x-axis and the total column in the y-axis. This way my title is automatically created based on the fields I've selected, which means I don't have to do anything. I've then created the other graph already, as well as the button for the other bookmark, which I've then hidden. And the same thing applies here. I just dragged quantity and salesperson into the canvas and then turned that into a graph. Likewise, the y-axis and the title is created on its own without me having to do anything. All I have to do is create everything before I start creating my bookmarks. I don't have to do this, but it's easier. So I will hide this again. And when I then click total, I have my graph visible and my button called button quantity, which is simply a button called bookmark, which has the action of going to the quantity bookmark. Of course, I have to actually have a page before I can say to go to that page. In the quantity bookmark, all I've done is to make the quantity table visible and the button going back to the total bookmark visible. That way I can simply control click here to switch back and forth. I then want to align my graph so they're in the same position, likewise with the buttons. Otherwise it's going to be a bit dizzying to look at, which means I can see this one isn't aligned. That's definitely one method to do it. This isn't one I prefer. With this method, you've essentially doubled the amount of items you have in your selection here. You've also added bookmarks and you might have many pages, which means this ends up adding more clutter without being a superior method. I would recommend against it. I wanted to show this as a method because it's sort of an old school method before Power BI added the field parameters. In my field parameter, I want to first create the table. Well, I don't have to, but I'm going to. I've taken the liberty of creating the two basic measures, which I'll be using in a moment. In order to create the field parameters, I go into the modeling tab, say new parameter fields, and because I keep forgetting it myself, fields is just what Power BI calls columns. I will call this quantity or total, and then I simply drag and drop the fields that I want to use. And this will dictate the order that they occur in, which will dictate the order in my selection, but that can be changed later. It'll already add a slicer, which is fine. And then I want that to be an exclusive slicer. This has created a new table, which right now only has one column, except that's not actually the truth. If we go under table view, I can see that I actually have 3 columns. This table is generated automatically based on one line here. We have the table constructor, the curly brackets, and then I have 3 columns, sum of quantity, sum of total, which is the names that show up right here when I can click. That can be changed here in the code. So maybe I want it to be called quantity and total because it's just assumed that this is a sum. The third parameter is the order, in other words, the index position, which simply dictates whether quantity or total should be in the top. And this is hard-coded, so I can change it like this. And that won't actually change the order of the rows because that's dictated on which comes first inside of the table, but it will change what shows up first in the slicer, meaning you can always change this later on if you want to. You don't have to physically change the position of the rows. So like this. The fancy thing about this construction is that it uses this sort of new function called NameOf. If I just try to get intelligence to work, it will return the name of a column or measure. And you can see that here it takes the measure sales sum of quantity, which would normally give a value, but it instead returns the text that is the name. Because if I remove this NameOf, what I'm going to get is the actual value, which in this case would be 10, because that is, if I go into the other table, that was the quantity. That is then, in this case, simply the sum with no filters applied, which is not what I want. I could then add, actually I should show that first. In order to use this field parameter, all I have to do is drag it into my table, like so, and it's not going to show anything for total, which is expected because I screwed that up on purpose. And apparently it wanted to troll me and it put quantity or total in the legend and not the y-axis. This is operating the way I want it to, the way it's expected to do, because this is functionally the same as saying salesperson and then adding the total and turning that into a graph. This is functionally the same, nothing has changed, but quantity doesn't work because something is wrong here. And if we go back in, it's because it's returning the value 10 and that doesn't make sense for what Power BI is expecting. because it's expecting to use this column in order to go into this measure of fields and grabbing that related value. Which means grabbing the related value of 10 doesn't make sense because there's no column or measure named 10. If I instead wrap this in quotation marks in order to make it literal text, I get the text that is the measure, and it will now work properly the way I expect it to. And this is where the brilliance of NameOf comes into play, because this is a hard-coded value, which means it's vulnerable to any changes in my measures. Normally, I wouldn't expect someone else to go in and change the names of my measures, but you might want to, because again, I've called it sum of quantity and sum of total. And if I just make the right hand side a bit smaller, okay, I can't do that, but you can see here I have the ellipsis. So maybe someone says, okay, I don't want to have long measure names. I want to go in and remove that sum of because it's kind of implied. Okay, that's already been used. So if I just call it quantity instead, now it breaks because my field parameter quantity is trying to go in and grab this TBL sales sum of quantity, which no longer exists because it's called quantity with two Y's, and it can't find that anywhere. If I instead remove the quotation marks and use the name of, it will now create a link between the measure itself and its literal text, and it still can't find that quantity because I changed the name, and I also removed the sum of. This has now created a direct link between the measure itself and the literal text string that is its name, which means that anytime I change quantity, and you can see that in once I go in here and change it, means if I go in here and delete the y, it gets mad because I already have that column here. So I want to go back to calling it sum of quantity. And when I then go back here, I can see that because the name of function is going in and grabbing the measure, that means there's a direct link between the measure, which means anytime I change that measure, the name of function updates, which means they are permanently linked. And it still returns the literal text string because that's just how field parameters work. That was part one. The second part is to get an updating title, and actually it's smart enough to do that on its own because I haven't changed anything here. And this will update on its own as long as I don't change anything. But maybe you're not satisfied with the byword. You don't want this to be updated the way it does, because maybe if I had an extra column, I've now added an extra column called department, and maybe I want to add that, but I don't want it to show up in the title, which right now it will, which is annoying. So I want to remove department from the name. I can create a measure that will create the text I want to use for my title. This slicer will slice my table called quantity or total, which means because I can only select one option from my slicer, this table will only return one row, which means I can check what is the value in this column, either quantity or total, which is exactly what I'll do. I can create this new measure called title, where I want to create a variable first just for ease, which should be equal to the max of that column in the quantity or total table. And I think that was the first one. And then I actually need to return something. And for some reason it wanted to add it to the tooltips. So okay, actually I want that to be a card. That will return quantity or total. I can then do a basic if statement to say, hey, if this is equal to quantity, then I want to use that in the title. And if not, I want to use total. And you could make that fancier using a switch statement if you had multiple selections. I think that might be a bit confusing if you have too many options, because at that point you may as well make a page dedicated to that specific visualization. So I would only use this if I have probably only two options. Otherwise it gets confusing. Meaning if my current selection is equal to quantity, then I want to return quantity, and otherwise I want to return total. What I want to return is then the result and per salesperson, and I need a space, and then I can extend that. So this will now update. I still need to change my graph to use this as its title, which is simply going into formatting, saying general, title, and then here I have a conditional formatting where I can then say I should use the field, not first salesperson, but I should use TBL sales called title, which is then text. That was a nice and simple way to handle that. So, yep,